A snip of cold steel echoing in a silent marble hallway was all it took to sign a death warrant. Charlotte, dripping in diamonds and fueled by bitter jealousy, thought she was simply putting a pregnant, lowly maid in her place. As the dark strands of hair fell to the floor, she smiled, completely oblivious to the catastrophic mistake she had just made. She didn't know the woman weeping on the tiles wasn't just a servant. She was the untouchable queen of the underworld. The Falcone estate, a sprawling limestone fortress hidden behind the dense, ancient tree lines of Long Island's North Shore, was a place where silence spoke louder than words. For Lorenzo Falcone, the undisputed head of the Cosa Nostra's most powerful syndicate, the estate was a sanctuary of order. For his fiancée, Charlotte Kensington, it was a gilded mirror that constantly reflected her deepest, darkest insecurities. Charlotte was not a woman who blended into the background. She was a physically imposing figure, heavily built, with a prominent, fleshy face and a thick, soft frame that no amount of custom-tailored Chanel or Dior could disguise. While the other women in their elite, dangerous social circle spent their days doing Pilates and starving themselves on expensive juices to maintain razor-thin figures, Charlotte found her only solace in indulgence. She was fat, a fact she was acutely aware of every time she caught her reflection in the estate's Venetian mirrors. Her wealth, however, acted as an impenetrable shield against the whispers of high society. She was the only daughter of Richard Kensington, a corrupt shipping magnate who controlled the ports of New York and New Jersey. Lorenzo Falcone didn't propose to Charlotte out of love or physical attraction. He proposed because marrying her meant absolute control over the eastern seaboard's smuggling routes. It was a cold, transactional arrangement. Lorenzo treated her with a chilling, detached politeness. He bought her massive emeralds, provided her with an army of private security, and allowed her to redecorate the west wing of the mansion. But he rarely touched her. He never looked at her with the burning, consuming passion she read about in her romance novels. And in the absence of his affection, Charlotte's mind became a breeding ground for a toxic, all-consuming paranoia. Her jealousy found its target in the most unlikely of places, a newly hired maid named Sienna Hayes. Sienna was a quiet, unassuming woman in her mid-20s. She had arrived at the estate 3 months prior, her belly already rounding with the undeniable curve of a second trimester pregnancy. She wore the standard charcoal gray uniform of the Falcone staff, her long, beautiful dark hair always tied back in a neat, modest braid. Despite her loose, flattering clothing and the exhaustion etched into her pale features, Sienna possessed a delicate, haunting beauty that made Charlotte's blood boil. What drove Charlotte to the edge of madness wasn't just Sienna's face. It was the bizarre, unspoken dynamic between the maid and the most dangerous men in the house. Charlotte first noticed it during a formal dinner party. Lorenzo was seated at the head of the long mahogany table, discussing union payouts with his capos. Charlotte, squeezed into a suffocating, emerald-green silk corset gown that dug painfully into her ribs, sat to his right, desperately trying to command the room's attention. Sienna had entered to clear the appetizer plates. As the pregnant maid reached across the table, her hand trembled slightly, causing a silver fork to clatter against the fine china. Normally, a mistake like that in the Falcone household would result in immediate dismissal or a harsh reprimand from the head of staff. Instead, the entire room went dead silent. Matteo Russo, Lorenzo's ruthless, scarred underboss, immediately stood up, not to yell at her, but to gently take the heavy silver platter out of Sienna's hands. "Let me take that." "You shouldn't be lifting," Matteo had murmured, his voice entirely devoid of its usual terrifying gravel. Charlotte's jaw had practically unhinged. Matteo Russo didn't help servants. Matteo Russo broke people's kneecaps for fun. But it was Lorenzo's reaction that truly planted the seed of Charlotte's psychotic jealousy. Lorenzo had stopped speaking mid-sentence. His dark, piercing eyes locked onto Sienna. It wasn't a look of anger. To Charlotte's distorted, insecure mind, it looked like deep, hidden lust. It looked like concern. Lorenzo had watched Sienna walk out of the room, his jaw clenched so tight the muscles ticked beneath his olive skin, before finally turning back to his men. From that night on, Charlotte became obsessed. She watched Sienna like a hawk. She noticed how the armed guards in the hallways always subtly stepped aside to give the pregnant maid a wide berth. She noticed that Sienna was never assigned heavy labor, only light dusting and arranging flowers. Charlotte's deep-seated hatred for her own body morphed into a venomous, misdirected rage toward the slender, pregnant girl. Lorenzo is sleeping with her, Charlotte convinced herself, violently stabbing a piece of rich chocolate cake with her fork in the solarium one afternoon. That's his bastard child she's carrying. He ignores me, his wealthy, powerful fiancé, for a dirty, penniless whore. The narrative took root in her mind, fed by her own massive insecurities. Charlotte felt humiliated. She imagined the staff laughing at her behind her back. The fat, ugly, rich girl whose dangerous fiancé was knocking up the help right under her nose. The pressure cooker of Charlotte's mind was whistling, the steam building to a lethal pressure. She needed to assert her dominance. She needed to remind everyone in the Falcone estate exactly who was going to be the next queen of this empire. She just needed the perfect opportunity to strike. The opportunity presented itself on a dreary Tuesday afternoon in late October. Heavy rain battered the massive arched windows of the estate, casting a grey, oppressive gloom over the marble corridors. Lorenzo had left early that morning for Manhattan, accompanied by Matteo and a convoy of heavily armored SUVs, to settle a violent dispute with a rogue faction of the Luchés family. He wasn't expected back until midnight. Charlotte was left to her own devices. She spent the morning stress-eating heavily buttered croissants and pacing her opulent bedroom, her mood souring with every passing hour. Her father, Richard, had sent 2 of his own personal bodyguards, large, thuggish men named Craig and Miller, to watch over her while the Falcone men were away. They were Kensington men, loyal only to Charlotte's father, and by extension to her. Around 2 in the afternoon, Charlotte decided to venture into Lorenzo's private study to look for a specific vintage of Bordeaux she knew he kept in his hidden bar. The study was strictly off-limits to everyone except Lorenzo and Matteo, but Charlotte, drunk on her own perceived authority, pushed the heavy oak doors open without knocking. She froze. There, sitting on Lorenzo's expensive leather Chesterfield sofa, was Sienna. The pregnant maid wasn't cleaning. She wasn't dusting. She was sitting with her feet tucked under her, gently running her fingers over a small silver music box that Charlotte knew Lorenzo kept locked inside his desk drawer. Sienna was quietly weeping, her tears falling onto the velvet cushions, her long dark braid undone so that her hair spilled over her shoulders in beautiful thick waves. A blinding, white-hot rage exploded behind Charlotte's eyes. "What in the hell do you think you are doing?" Charlotte's voice cracked like a bullwhip through the quiet room. Sienna gasped, nearly dropping the music box. She scrambled to her feet, her hands immediately flying to protect her swollen, 6-month pregnant belly. Her wide, terrified eyes met Charlotte's furious gaze. "Miss Kensington, I was just—" "Shut your mouth," Charlotte roared, her large frame vibrating with fury as she stomped into the room. Her expensive silk robe billowed behind her. She looked at the music box on the table, then at the indentation Sienna had left on Lorenzo's sacred sofa. "You filthy, thieving little rat. You think because my fiancé is out of the house, you can just waltz into his private sanctuary? You think you can steal from him?" "I wasn't stealing," Sienna pleaded, her voice trembling, but possessing a strange, underlying firmness. He, Lorenzo. Mr. Falcone, let me see it. Please, Miss Kensington, you don't understand. Oh, I understand perfectly, Charlotte sneered, stepping closer, using her immense size to intimidate the smaller, pregnant woman. I see exactly what is going on here. I see the way the guards look at you. I see the way he looks at you. You think you're special because you let him use you like a cheap mattress? You think this bastard you're carrying gives you leverage in my house? Sienna's face drained of all color. She took a step back, her back hitting the edge of the mahogany desk. Don't speak about my child, she whispered, a sudden fierce fire igniting in her dark eyes. You know nothing. The defiance in the maid's voice was the match that lit the powder keg of Charlotte's insanity. How dare this nothing, this servant, look at her with such contempt? Charlotte's mind snapped. She marched over to the study doors and yanked them open. Craig, Miller, get in here right now. The two Kensington thugs rushed into the room, their hands instinctively dropping to their holstered weapons. Hold her, Charlotte commanded, pointing a shaking, diamond-ringed finger at Sienna. Miss Kensington, she's pregnant. Miller hesitated, glancing at Sienna's prominent stomach. I said hold the bitch, Charlotte shrieked, her face turning a mottled, ugly purple. Or I will call my father right now and have you both thrown into the East River. Fearing the wrath of Richard Kensington, the two massive men stepped forward and grabbed Sienna by her arms. Sienna struggled, kicking and twisting, crying out in panic. Let go of me. You can't do this. If Lorenzo finds out. Lorenzo isn't here. Charlotte laughed, a harsh, maniacal sound. She turned toward Lorenzo's desk, her eyes scanning the surface, until they landed on a pair of heavy antique iron shears he used for cutting cigars and opening thick, wax-sealed parcels. She snatched them up, the metal cold and heavy in her palm. She turned back to Sienna, her eyes gleaming with a sick, sadistic joy. You think your pretty little face and your long, beautiful hair makes you better than me. Charlotte taunted, stepping right up to the struggling woman. You think Lorenzo wants a fragile little doll? Let's see how much he wants you when I'm done with you. No, please, Sienna begged, thrashing wildly. Don't touch me. Think about what you're doing, Charlotte. I swear to God you are making a mistake that will get you killed. The only mistake was you forgetting your place. Charlotte hissed. She reached out with her left hand, grabbing a thick handful of Sienna's beautiful dark hair, pulling her head back sharply. Sienna screamed as the roots burned. With a swift, brutal motion, Charlotte brought the heavy iron shears up and clamped them down on the thick locks. Snip. The sound was shockingly loud in the room. A massive chunk of dark hair fell to the Persian rug. Sienna sobbed, shutting her eyes tightly, her body going limp in the guard's arms as she realized she couldn't overpower them. She stopped fighting, curling inward as much as she could to protect her stomach. Charlotte was manic, panting heavily, sweat beading on her forehead. She hacked and slashed with the scissors, her movements violent and uncoordinated. She didn't just cut the hair, she destroyed it. She sheared it dangerously close to the scalp, leaving jagged, humiliating tufts. You're nothing, Charlotte screamed with every cut. You're a fat, ugly, pregnant whore. You are dirt beneath my shoes. The irony of Charlotte, a severely overweight woman who spent her life battling her own reflection, screaming those specific insults at a pregnant woman, was entirely lost on her in the haze of her psychotic breakdown. It took less than 3 minutes for Charlotte to strip Sienna of her dignity. When she finally stepped back, breathing heavily, the heavy shears slipped from her sweaty fingers and clattered to the floor. Sienna was a ghost. Her beautiful hair was gone, replaced by a jagged, uneven, humiliating mess. Strands of dark hair covered her shoulders, her gray uniform, and the expensive rug beneath her feet. Drop her, Charlotte ordered, fixing her robe, trying to regain her composure. The guards let go. Sienna collapsed to her knees. She didn't wail. She didn't scream. She simply placed both of her hands protectively over her pregnant belly. Slowly, she lifted her head and looked at Charlotte. There were no tears left in Sienna's eyes. There was only a cold, chilling void. It was a look of such absolute, terrifying certainty that, for a brief fraction of a second, a cold spike of genuine dread pierced through Charlotte's arrogant heart. "Clean this mess up," Charlotte spat, trying to mask her sudden unease. "And if you ever look at Lorenzo again, I'll take the scissors to your face." Charlotte turned on her heel and marched out of the room, her guards following closely behind. She felt victorious. She had established her dominance. She had put the little whore in her place. She had no idea she had just dug her own grave. The storm outside worsened as the evening approached, the thunder masking the sound of multiple heavy vehicles tearing up the long gravel driveway of the estate. Lorenzo Falcone had returned hours earlier than anticipated. The sit-down with the Luxes faction had been brief, bloody, and decisive. Lorenzo was exhausted, his bespoke charcoal suit damp from the rain, his mind already shifting from the violence of his business to the heavy responsibilities waiting for him at home. He walked through the grand front doors, flanked by Matteo Russo and 4 of his most lethal enforcers. The estate was eerily quiet, too quiet. "Get me a drink, Matteo," Lorenzo grumbled, loosening his tie as he strode purposefully toward the west wing, heading straight for his private study. He needed the quiet isolation of his sanctuary to decompress. He pushed open the heavy oak doors. The scene that greeted him stopped the pulse in his veins. The air in the room seemed to instantly freeze, dropping to a temperature that felt like absolute zero. Sienna was still on the floor. She hadn't moved. She was curled in on herself, her hands resting on her swollen stomach, staring blankly at the wall. Surrounding her, scattered across the priceless Persian rug like fallen crow feathers, were massive clumps of her dark hair. Her head was a jagged, mutilated mess of uneven crops and exposed scalp, red and irritated where the heavy shears had scraped her skin. The antique iron scissors lay discarded a few feet away. For 3 agonizing seconds, Lorenzo Falcone didn't breathe. His eyes took in the scissors, the hair, the hollow, traumatized look in Sienna's eyes. "Boss?" Matteo's voice came from the doorway, holding a glass of scotch. Matteo stopped dead. The glass of scotch slipped from the hardened killer's hand, shattering against the marble threshold. "Sienna," Lorenzo whispered, his voice cracking. The terrifying, untouchable Don of the Cosa Nostra dropped to his knees on the floor, ignoring the shards of glass and the hair. He reached out with trembling hands, hovering them over her mutilated hair, terrified to touch her, terrified he might break her further. "Sienna, Sorellina, who did this to you?" Before Sienna could part her dry lips to answer, the sharp, confident click of high heels echoed down the hallway. Charlotte, freshly showered and wearing a flowing crimson dress that strained against her wide hips, appeared in the doorway. She had heard the cars arrive and came down to greet her fiancé, eager to play the role of the devoted future wife. She stopped, taking in the scene. Lorenzo on his knees, Matteo standing frozen, his hand resting on the grip of his holstered 9mm. Charlotte smiled, a sickening, smug expression crossing her heavy features. "Oh, darling, you're home early," she cooed, stepping over the shattered scotch glass. "I see you found the mess. Don't worry, I handled it." Lorenzo slowly turned his head. His eyes, usually a calm, calculating dark brown, were pitch black, wide with a terrifying, unhinged madness. "You handled it." "She was in here snooping, Lorenzo," Charlotte said, waving her hand dismissively, completely failing to read the lethal atmosphere in the room. "I caught her playing with your things. The little rat thought she could steal from us, and frankly, I was sick of her parading her fat, pregnant belly around the house like she owned the place. I decided she needed a lesson in humility." She won't be trying to seduce you anymore, I promise you that." Silence descended on the room. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the agonizing silence that immediately precedes a catastrophic explosion. Matteo Russo, a man who had murdered dozens of men with his bare hands, slowly turned his head to look at Charlotte. He looked at her not with anger, but with the hollow, pitying look one gives a dead dog on the side of the highway. "You cut her hair," Lorenzo stated. His voice was no longer a shout. It was a soft, deadly whisper that made the fine hairs on the back of Charlotte's neck stand up. "I did," Charlotte said, her smile faltering slightly as the tension finally began to penetrate her thick skull. "She's just a maid, Lorenzo. My father's men helped me restrain her. It was perfectly—" "Matteo," Lorenzo interrupted, his voice void of all human emotion. "Disarm the Kensington guards. If they breathe too loudly, shoot them in the stomach and let them bleed out on my floor." Matteo didn't hesitate. He drew his weapon and vanished from the doorway. Seconds later, the sounds of shouting and a brutal scuffle echoed from the main hall, followed by the heavy thud of bodies hitting the marble. Charlotte gasped, taking a step back, her hands flying to her mouth. "Lorenzo, what are you doing?" "Those are my father's men." Lorenzo stood up. He didn't look at Charlotte. He looked down at Sienna, extending a gentle hand to help her stand. He pulled the trembling, pregnant woman into a fiercely protective embrace, tucking her mutilated head under his chin. "Your father's," Renzo said, his voice echoing with the promise of absolute destruction, "is a dead man. And you, Charlotte, you have no idea what you have just done." "She's a whore," Charlotte shrieked, panic finally setting in as she realized the massive miscalculation she had made. "She's just a pregnant maid." "She is not a maid," Lorenzo snarled, the monstrous, predatory side of him finally breaking through his composed facade. He pointed a trembling, furious finger at Sienna. "Her name is Sienna Moretti. She is the widow of my cousin, Angelo Moretti, the man who was tortured and murdered by the Rossi Syndicate 6 months ago." Charlotte's blood ran cold. The color drained from her flushed, fleshy face. Angelo Moretti. Everyone in the underworld knew that name. He was Lorenzo's blood brother, his most trusted confidant, who had been brutally assassinated. "She is carrying the last heir of the Moretti bloodline," Lorenzo continued, taking a slow, menacing step toward Charlotte. "The Rossi family put a $5 million bounty on her head to wipe out the bloodline completely. I hid her here. I put her in a maid's uniform because it was the only demographic those assassins wouldn't look twice at. I swore on my mother's grave to Angelo that I would protect his wife and his unborn child with the full might of the Falcone Empire." Lorenzo stopped a foot away from Charlotte. She was taller and heavier than him, but in that moment, she felt like a microscopic insect standing before a towering inferno. "For 6 months, my entire syndicate has bled to keep this woman safe," Lorenzo whispered, his breath hot against Charlotte's terrified face. "She is the most protected, most revered woman in the entire American Mafia. And you brought your father's filthy thugs into my home, you laid hands on a pregnant Moretti, and you mutilated her." Charlotte couldn't speak. Her throat closed up. The reality of her actions crashed down upon her with the weight of a falling skyscraper. She hadn't disciplined a servant. She had just assaulted underworld royalty. She had broken the most sacred code of the Cosa Nostra, harming the pregnant widow of a made man. "Lorenzo, I didn't know," Charlotte stammered, tears of sheer terror welling in her eyes. Her legs gave out, her heavy frame collapsing onto her knees in front of him. "Please, I didn't know." Lorenzo looked down at her, pulling a silk handkerchief from his pocket and wiping a stray drop of blood from Sienna's scalp where the scissors had nicked her. "Ignorance," Lorenzo said softly, "is not an excuse that prevents a war, Charlotte. It is just the excuse you will cry when you realize how long I am going to make you suffer for this." The heavy oak doors of Lorenzo's study slammed shut, sealing Charlotte's fate. Outside in the grand hallway, the air was thick with the metallic scent of blood and the muffled groans of broken men. Matteo Russo had neutralized the two Kensington guards, Craig and Miller, with terrifying efficiency. They lay on the imported Italian marble, their limbs bent at unnatural angles, their custom suits ruined. They were breathing, but only because Matteo had strict orders to keep them alive for questioning. Inside the study, Charlotte was weeping hysterically, her heavy frame quaking as she knelt on the floor. Her mind, usually clouded by delusions of grandeur and entitlement, was finally sobering up to the lethal reality of her environment. She wasn't dealing with polite high society. She was dealing with the apex predators of New York. "Lorenzo, please, I love you," Charlotte sobbed, grasping at the hem of Lorenzo's trousers. "I was just jealous. I thought you were sleeping with her. You have to understand, I did it out of love for you." Lorenzo looked down at her, his expression akin to a man observing a cockroach on his dining table. He gently guided Sienna to the leather Chesterfield sofa, wrapping her in his own suit jacket. He then turned back to his fiancée, smoothly kicking his leg to dislodge her clinging, manicured hands. "Love?" Lorenzo repeated, the word sounding foreign and harsh on his tongue. "You know nothing of love, Charlotte. You know only greed, gluttony, and a pathetic, desperate need to feel superior to those you deem beneath you. You used your father's money to buy compliance, to shield yourself from the reality of who you truly are, a vicious, insecure woman." Charlotte flinched, the words striking her deeper than any physical blow. Her entire life, she had used her father's immense wealth to camouflage her deep-seated insecurities about her physical appearance. Her fatness was the elephant in every room, heavily draped in exclusive runway couture and dripping in Cartier, daring anyone to make a comment. She had wielded her size and her money like a bludgeon. Now stripped of her authority, she felt obscenely exposed. "Take her to the cellar," Lorenzo commanded without raising his voice. Two massive Falcone enforcers, men with dead eyes and scarred knuckles, stepped into the room. They hauled Charlotte to her feet. No, you can't put me down there." Charlotte shrieked, kicking and thrashing, her heavy crimson dress tearing at the seams. "I am Charlotte Kensington. My father controls the port of Newark. He controls the shipping lines. You need us. You need him." "Your father," Lorenzo said softly, picking up the antique iron shears from the floor, "is currently losing his empire as we speak. I sent the order the moment I saw Sienna's hair." Charlotte was dragged out of the room, her terrified screams echoing through the vast, empty halls of the estate, growing fainter as she was hauled down into the dark, soundproofed depths of the mansion's subterranean holding cells. With Charlotte gone, the adrenaline keeping Sienna upright evaporated. She collapsed against the cushions, clutching her stomach, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "Matteo," Lorenzo barked, tossing the shears onto his desk. "Call Dr. Castellano. Tell him to get his private team here right now. Bring the ultrasound machine, and get the cleaners in here. I want every strand of this hair removed before she opens her eyes again." Within 30 minutes, the Falcone estate transformed into a fortress. Heavily armed men patrolled the perimeter. Dr. Leonard Castellano, a highly discreet, elite concierge physician who catered exclusively to New York's wealthiest and most dangerous families, arrived with a team of trauma nurses. Sienna was moved to the master suite, pumped full of sedatives safe for the baby, and hooked up to monitors. Down in the cold, damp dark of the cellar, Charlotte sat on a bare concrete floor. The air was freezing, biting through her torn silk dress. There was no mirror, but she didn't need one to know she looked monstrous. Her makeup was smeared, her hair tangled, her body shivering and aching. The heavy iron-barred door offered no escape. For the first time in her pampered, ruthless life, Charlotte Kensington was experiencing true, unfiltered terror. She huddled into a corner, wrapping her arms around her thick waist, desperately praying that her father, Richard, would unleash hell on the Falcone syndicate to save her. She told herself that Lorenzo was bluffing. Her father was a titan of industry. No one, not even the Cosa Nostra, could dismantle Kensington shipping overnight. She was wrong. 48 hours later, the underworld of the eastern seaboard was in chaos. Lorenzo Falcone had not simply retaliated. He had orchestrated a financial and physical massacre. Utilizing his deep, unholy alliances with corrupt officials at Credit Suisse and highly placed union bosses, Lorenzo initiated a hostile, scorched-earth takeover of Richard Kensington's assets. Ships carrying billions in Kensington cargo were mysteriously denied entry at ports from Miami to Halifax. Union dockworkers, loyal to the Falcone payroll, walked off the job, leaving Kensington's perishable goods to rot in the sun. Worse, Lorenzo leaked a mountain of meticulously gathered blackmail, offshore accounts, tax evasion schemes, and evidence of human trafficking directly to the federal authorities. Kensington shipping wasn't just bleeding money. It was facing complete federal seizure. At 3 a.m. on Thursday, Richard Kensington was dragged into the underground parking garage of a defunct meat-packing plant in the Bronx. He was a wealthy, arrogant man, completely unaccustomed to physical violence. He wore a rumpled Armani suit, his face bruised, his expensive Rolex stripped from his wrist by the Falcone soldiers who had pulled him from his Manhattan penthouse bed. Lorenzo sat on a folding chair in the center of the dimly lit garage, calmly smoking a cigar. Matteo stood beside him, holding a thick manila folder. "Lorenzo," Richard panted, blood trickling from his split lip. "Have you lost your damn mind? The feds are raiding my offices. You're burning billions of dollars. We had a deal. Charlotte is going to be your wife." "Charlotte is a dead woman breathing," Lorenzo stated, exhaling a thick plume of blue smoke. "She assaulted a pregnant woman under my protection. A Moretti. She cut her hair like a deranged animal." Richard blinked, confusion washing over his panic. She cut a maid's hair. "You're destroying my entire legacy over a haircut." "That maid is carrying the heir of my blood brother," Lorenzo said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, gravelly timbre. "Your daughter brought thugs into my home. She violated the sanctity of my territory. In our world, Richard, blood demands blood. You're a civilian who got too comfortable playing in the deep end. Now you drown." "Please," Richard begged, falling to his knees. The arrogance of the shipping magnate vanished, replaced by the pathetic whimpering of a broken man. "I'll do whatever you want. I'll sign over the ports. Just don't kill me. Punish Charlotte. She's always been a spoiled, jealous, unstable burden. Do whatever you want to her. Just let me live." Lorenzo's eyes narrowed with utter disgust. "Bring her up," he ordered quietly into a radio strapped to his chest. A black SUV pulled into the garage, its tires squealing against the concrete. The back doors opened, and 2 guards dragged Charlotte out. She was unrecognizable. She had spent 2 days in the freezing cellar. Her expensive dress was filthy, her face swollen from crying, her heavy body trembling uncontrollably. When Charlotte saw her father kneeling on the concrete, a spark of hope ignited in her deadened eyes. "Daddy," she screamed, struggling against her captors. "Daddy, tell them to let me go. Have your men kill them." Richard Kensington looked at his daughter, his fleshy face contorted with a hatred so pure it made Charlotte freeze. "You stupid, fat, worthless cow," Richard spat, the venom in his voice echoing off the concrete pillars. Charlotte gasped, as if he had shot her in the chest. "Daddy, you ruined me," Richard screamed, spittle flying from his lips. "I gave you everything. I bought you that engagement. I set you up to be a queen, and you throw it all away because you were jealous of a servant? You cost me my empire. I hope they cut you into pieces." Charlotte's mind shattered. The shield of her family's wealth, the only thing that had ever validated her miserable existence, was gone. Her own father was offering her to the wolves to save his own skin. She collapsed onto the dirty concrete, sobbing so violently she began to hyperventilate. The agonizing realization crashed over her. Without her money, without the fear her father's name instilled, she was nothing, just a cruel, deeply insecure woman who had written her own death sentence. Lorenzo stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. He walked over to Richard, took the manila folder from Matteo, and tossed it onto the ground in front of the sobbing magnate. "Sign the transfer documents," Lorenzo ordered. "Sign over the New Jersey ports, the Cayman accounts, and the real estate. Every single dime. And then you'll let me go?" Richard asked, his hand shaking as he pulled a gold Mont Blanc pen from his pocket. "Sign," Lorenzo repeated. Richard scrambled to sign the papers, desperate to survive. When he finished, he pushed the folder back toward Lorenzo's polished dress shoes. Lorenzo picked up the folder, handed it to Matteo, and turned his back. "Matteo, put a bullet in his right knee, take his tongue, and drop him in front of the FBI field office in Lower Manhattan. Let him spend the rest of his miserable life in federal prison, unable to speak." "No, Lorenzo. We had a deal." Richard screamed as Matteo calmly drew a serrated combat knife and his suppressed pistol. "Bring her," Lorenzo ordered his men, pointing at Charlotte, completely ignoring her father's agonizing screams as Matteo went to work. The show isn't over. The stress and trauma of the assault had taken a severe toll on Sienna's body. 3 days after the incident, deep in the heavily fortified master wing of the Falcone estate, Sienna's water broke. She was only 30 weeks pregnant. Panic swept through the syndicate. A premature labor for the Moretti heir was the nightmare scenario Lorenzo had fought so hard to prevent. The estate's medical team immediately stabilized her, but Dr. Castellano insisted she needed the neonatal intensive care unit at Mount Sinai Hospital. Moving her was a logistical nightmare. The Rossi family, sniffing out weakness following the public destruction of the Kensington Empire, had put shooters on the streets. "We locked down the entire FDR drive," Lorenzo commanded, pacing the war room of the estate. "I want 3 decoy ambulances. I want snipers on the rooftops surrounding Mount Sinai. We buy the entire VIP maternity ward. No doctors or nurses go in or out without Matteo clearing them personally." The motorcade that transported Sienna into Manhattan was a rolling fortress of armored SUVs and heavy weaponry. Lorenzo rode in the back of the fortified ambulance, holding Sienna's trembling hand. Her jagged, ruined hair had been carefully trimmed by a stylist Lorenzo brought in, but the emotional scars remained. She was terrified, crying out in pain as contractions ripped through her slender body. "You're going to be okay, Sorolina," Lorenzo promised, his voice a steady, grounding anchor amidst the chaos. "Angelo is watching over you. I won't let anything happen to this child." At Mount Sinai, the operation was flawless. The Cosa Nostra effectively annexed the 12th floor. Men in tailored suits with bulges under their jackets stood at every elevator, bank, and stairwell. For 12 agonizing hours, Sienna labored. Outside the delivery room, Lorenzo waited, a man who commanded thousands, entirely powerless in the face of nature. He stared at the white linoleum floor, praying to a god he rarely spoke to, begging for the survival of the child. At 4:12 a.m., a sharp, piercing cry echoed through the sterile halls. Dr. Castellano stepped out, pulling down his surgical mask, a weary but triumphant smile on his face. "It's a boy, Don Falcone. He's small, and he'll need to stay in the NICU for a few weeks, but his lungs are strong. He's a fighter, just like his father." Lorenzo closed his eyes, a profound, heavy relief washing over him. The Moretti bloodline survived. Charlotte's cruel, psychotic attempt to strip Sienna of her dignity and break her spirit had failed. While new life bloomed in the sterile light of the hospital, Charlotte was descending into total darkness. Lorenzo had not killed her. Death, he decided, was entirely too merciful for a woman whose entire identity was wrapped up in her vanity and her wealth. Instead, he subjected her to a fate she considered far worse than a bullet. Through his connections, Lorenzo legally erased Charlotte Kensington. He liquidated her trust funds and funneled the money into shell corporations. He had his men completely empty her luxury penthouse on Park Avenue, burning her designer clothes, her jewelry, and her extensive collection of expensive handbags. Then, in the dead of night, they drove a heavily sedated Charlotte across state lines to a grim, underfunded, state-run psychiatric facility in the rusted industrial outskirts of Pennsylvania. Matteo had paid off the corrupt director to admit her under the name Jane Doe. When Charlotte finally woke up, the drugs making her head spin, she was no longer in a gilded cage. She was lying on a thin, plastic-covered mattress in a cramped room with peeling green paint. The air smelled of bleach and boiled cabbage. She wore a scratchy, oversized gray hospital gown that clung unflatteringly to her heavy frame. She groggily sat up, rubbing her throbbing head, trying to make sense of her surroundings. The door opened, and a stern-faced orderly walked in, holding a small paper cup of pills. "Time for your medication, Jane," the orderly said, in a bored, monotonous voice. "My name is not Jane." Charlotte croaked, her throat dry. She tried to muster the arrogant, booming voice of the shipping heiress, but it came out as a pathetic squeak. "I am Charlotte Kensington. My fiancé is Lorenzo Falcone. Call him. Call my father. I will have this entire hospital shut down." The orderly didn't even blink. He had heard 1,000 crazy stories from 1,000 broken minds. He simply placed the cup on the bedside table. "Take your pills or we'll strap you to the bed and inject them. Your choice." Charlotte lunged off the bed, her heavy feet slapping against the cold linoleum. She rushed to the small barred window. She looked out, expecting to see the manicured lawns of Long Island or the sweeping skyline of Manhattan. Instead, she saw a desolate, dying Rust Belt town, gray and decaying under an overcast sky. She scrambled over to a small, scratched metal mirror bolted above a tiny sink. Charlotte stared at her reflection. There were no diamonds to distract from her double chin. There was no expensive makeup to contour her fleshy cheeks. Her hair was a greasy, matted mess. She was just a fat, terrified, entirely powerless woman locked in a cage she could never buy her way out of. She thought of the scissors. She thought of the sickening snip of Sienna's beautiful dark hair falling to the floor. She thought of the smug superiority she had felt in that fleeting, catastrophic moment. She had tried to destroy a queen disguised as a maid, only to realize too late that she was the one who was truly disposable. Charlotte slowly sank to the dirty floor, pulling her knees to her chest. She opened her mouth, and a long, agonizing wail tore from her throat, echoing down the sterile, uncaring hallways of the asylum. It was the sound of a woman mourning the death of her own life, a life she had meticulously destroyed with her own 2 hands, all for a fleeting moment of misplaced vengeance. She would spend the rest of her days in this gray purgatory, a ghost of the heiress she once was, haunted by the memory of the cold iron shears, completely unaware that hundreds of miles away, the baby she had nearly killed was taking his first victorious breaths. 3 years had passed since the brutal dismantling of the Kensington Empire. To the rest of the world, Richard Kensington was simply another corrupt billionaire who had spectacularly fallen from grace, currently rotting in the ADX Florence Supermax prison, permanently mute and wheelchair-bound. His daughter, Charlotte, had simply vanished into thin air, a whispered cautionary tale among the Manhattan elite about the dangers of crossing the wrong syndicates. But Charlotte hadn't vanished. She was exactly where Lorenzo Falcone had left her, buried alive in the decaying, fluorescent-lit purgatory of St. Jude's Psychiatric Hospital in rural Pennsylvania. Her life had been reduced to a miserable, heavily medicated routine. At 32 years old, Charlotte was unrecognizable. Without her personal trainers, private chefs, and custom-tailored corsets to shape her silhouette, her heavy, fat body had softened into a lumbering, exhausted frame. She shuffled down the linoleum corridors in slip-on hospital shoes, her thick thighs chafing beneath the scratchy cotton of her state-issued gown. Her once perfectly styled hair was now heavily threaded with premature gray, chopped short by the impatient, uncaring hospital staff to prevent lice. Every day was a battle against her own fractured mind. The crushing weight of her lost wealth, her ruined vanity, and the terrifying memory of Lorenzo's dead eyes haunted her every waking moment. Yet, the criminal underworld had a way of resurrecting ghosts when they proved useful. Don Domenico Rossi, the aging, desperate head of the Rossi syndicate, had spent the last 3 years bleeding territory and men to Lorenzo's ruthless expansion. The Falcone-Moretti alliance was an impenetrable wall. Desperate for a weakness, Rossi's top intelligence gatherers had finally tracked down the missing Kensington heiress. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon, exactly 3 years to the day since she had taken those iron shears to Sienna's hair, Charlotte was summoned to the visitor's room. She walked in heavily, her breathing labored, to find a man in a sharp charcoal suit sitting at a rusted metal table. He had a scarred chin and cold reptilian eyes. His name was Vincent Corelli, Rossi's most lethal enforcer. He had bribed the hospital director an exorbitant sum for 10 uninterrupted minutes with Jane Doe. "Hello, Charlotte," Vincent said smoothly, leaning back in his plastic chair. Charlotte flinched at her real name. She hadn't heard it in over 1,000 days. She collapsed into the chair opposite him, wrapping her fleshy arms protectively around her thick waist. "Who are you? Did my father send you?" She croaked, her voice raspy from disuse. "Your father is rotting in a cell, Charlotte," Vincent replied, sliding a manila envelope across the scratched table. "I represent a family that wants to see Lorenzo Falcone put in the ground, and we know you want the exact same thing." Charlotte's dull eyes flickered down to the envelope. With trembling, unmanicured fingers, she opened it. Inside were surveillance photographs. The first photo showed the Falcone estate in Long Island. The second showed Lorenzo Falcone, looking sharper and more dangerous than ever. But it was the third photograph that made Charlotte's breath catch in her throat. It was Sienna. She was no longer wearing a baggy gray maid's uniform. Sienna was captured stepping out of a bulletproof Maybach in front of a high-end Fifth Avenue boutique. She wore a stunning, tailored cream pantsuit that accentuated her elegant posture. But what drew Charlotte's eye, what made her stomach twist into nauseating knots of ancient jealousy, was Sienna's hair. It cascaded down her back in thick, luxurious raven-dark waves, shining with health and vitality. Beside her, holding her hand, was a beautiful 3-year-old boy with piercing dark eyes, the Moretti heir. "She's the untouchable Queen of New York now," Vincent sneered, tapping the photo. "Falcone practically worships the ground she walks on. They destroyed your life to elevate hers. We want to breach the estate, Charlotte. We want to take the boy. You lived there. You redecorated the West Wing. You know the blind spots, the old service tunnels, the security camera loops. Map the estate for us." Vincent leaned in, his voice dropping to a seductive whisper. "Do this, and we break you out of here today. We set you up in a penthouse in Geneva, millions in a Swiss account, private chefs, designer clothes, a first-class ticket back to the life you deserve. You don't have to die a fat, forgotten, crazy woman in this hellhole." For a fleeting, agonizing second, the old Charlotte flared to life. The greedy, vain, arrogant heiress wanted to snatch the pen from Vincent's hand. She wanted to draw the maps, watch Lorenzo's empire burn, and rip that beautiful hair from Sienna's scalp all over again. She wanted her diamonds back. She wanted her power back. But as Charlotte looked up from the photo to Vincent's eager face, a deeper, much darker realization washed over her. She remembered Matteo Russo's terrifying empty stare. She remembered the absolute surgical precision with which Lorenzo dismantled her father's billion-dollar empire in a matter of hours. The Cosa Nostra didn't make mistakes. Lorenzo Falcone didn't leave loose ends unless he wanted them left. A horrifying truth clicked into place inside Charlotte's shattered mind. Lorenzo knew she was here. He had always known. Charlotte began to laugh. It started as a wet, pathetic wheeze, but quickly escalated into a deep, guttural, hysterical cackle that shook her heavy frame. Tears streamed down her puffy cheeks as she rocked back and forth in the plastic chair. "You're crazy," Vincent frowned, his hand instinctively dropping toward the suppressed pistol hidden inside his jacket. "Stop laughing, you stupid cow. Map the estate." You think you found me?" Charlotte gasped, pointing a shaking, chubby finger at the hitman. "You think you slipped past Lorenzo Falcone? He is the devil. The devil doesn't lose his toys." Before Vincent could draw his weapon, the heavy steel door of the visitor's room clicked open. Carmine, the bored, stern-faced orderly who had fed Charlotte her medication for 3 years, stepped into the room. He wasn't holding a tray of pills today. He was holding a suppressed 9mm handgun. Vincent spun around, but he was entirely too slow. 2 rounds caught Vincent perfectly in the center of his forehead. The hitman slumped forward, his blood pooling over the photographs of Sienna and Lorenzo, dripping off the rusted metal table onto the linoleum floor. Charlotte didn't scream. She just pressed her heavy back against the cold cinder-block wall, hyperventilating, staring at the dead man in front of her. Carmine calmly stepped over Vincent's body, pulled a small paper cup from his pocket, and placed it on the only clean corner of the table. He looked at Charlotte with the same dead, emotionless eyes as Matteo Russo. "Don Falcone sends his regards, Miss Kensington," Carmine said in his monotonous, bored voice. "He appreciates you making the right choice today. The Rossi Syndicate will be eradicated by midnight. Time for your medication." Charlotte's mind finally snapped completely, plunging into a dark, impenetrable abyss from which she would never return. She reached out with a trembling, blood-spattered hand, took the paper cup, and swallowed the pills dry. She was buried alive, and the devil was holding the shovel. Hundreds of miles away on the sun-drenched, manicured lawns of the Falcone estate, there was no blood, no fear, and no madness. Sienna stood on the expansive marble terrace, a soft breeze off the Long Island Sound, playing with the long, dark hair she had patiently grown back over the last 3 years. She watched little Leonardo chasing a golden retriever across the grass, his joyous laughter echoing against the limestone walls of the fortress. She was no longer the terrified, pregnant maid hiding from assassins. She was Sienna Moretti, the deeply respected and fiercely protected matriarch of the family's legacy. Lorenzo stepped out onto the terrace, handing her a crystal glass of sparkling water. He wore a crisp, tailored suit, the undisputed king of his world. He stood beside her, his dark eyes softening as he watched the boy play. "Matteo called," Lorenzo said softly, his voice meant only for her. "The Rossi problem is being handled, and our guest in Pennsylvania remains secure." She proved to be surprisingly compliant. Sienna took a sip of her water, her expression calm and unbothered. She reached up, her fingers lightly brushing a beautiful vintage diamond hairpin that held back a thick lock of her dark hair, a gift from Lorenzo to commemorate the day Leo was born. She didn't feel pity for Charlotte. She didn't feel anger anymore either. In the brutal, unforgiving world of the Mafia, survival belonged to those who understood the weight of loyalty and the lethal price of arrogance. Charlotte had tried to cut away Sienna's dignity to feed her own massive ego, completely unaware that a crown isn't made of hair or diamonds. It is forged in blood, endurance, and quiet, unbreakable strength. "Leave her," Sienna murmured, turning her beautiful face to the sun, finally at total peace. Ghosts belong in the dark. What a thrilling conclusion. Did Charlotte get exactly what she deserved? Or was her punishment too extreme for her crimes? This gripping mafia romance drama proves that jealousy, insecurity, and arrogance can seal your fate in the blink of an eye. If you were captivated by Sienna's shocking hidden identity and Lorenzo's ruthless, calculated revenge, you won't want to miss our next story. Please hit that like button, share this video with your fellow drama lovers, and subscribe to our channel for more jaw-dropping, twist-filled tales. Ring the notification bell so you never miss an upload.